80 years ago, the U.S. military detonated 2 atomic bombs over Japan. An exhibit at the Fredericton Public Library documents the destruction. The exhibit was curated by Japan's Hiroshima Memorial Peace Museum. It shows the devastating effects of the bombings on those 2 cities and on the people living there. To launch the exhibit, the library hosted a talk by M.V. Ramana, a professor at the University of British Columbia.
And the most important thing to remember about the kind of history that I'm going to talk about is that there are over 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world, all of which are, almost all of them are more destructive than the 2 bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we live with the possibility, even if we don't actively contemplate it all the time, that at any moment these weapons can go off.
Stay tuned for the full talk. The exhibit at the Fredericton Public Library runs until October 31st.
My name is Liam MacDougall, and I am a second-year student at St. Thomas University, majoring in Sustainability and Environmental Studies and honoring in Political Science. I'm also a research assistant with the CEDAR Project, which stands for Contesting Energy Discourses Through Action Research, which is held at St. Thomas as well. This event today is brought to you in collaboration with the CEDAR Project, the Fredericton Public Library, the History and Human Rights Departments at STU, as well as the International Relations Program and the Sustainability and Environmental Studies Program at STU. It's my pleasure to introduce you all today to Dr. M.V. Ramana. He is visiting us from UBC Vancouver, where he is a professor, Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and the director of the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs School. Ramana is also a member on the International Panel on Fissile Materials, the Canadian Pugwash Group, the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and a part of the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. Ramana is also the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, and more recently, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. Prior to reading his more recent book, I've always felt that I've lacked sufficient knowledge to have a strong opinion on nuclear energy. But Ramana's book gave compelling arguments against nuclear and now has me convinced it is not the climate solution many think it is. More specifically to today's event, Ramana examines the link between nuclear energy and weapons in his book, stressing the fact that for energy or warfare, the nuclear process is interchangeable and interdependent. Nagasaki and Hiroshima are clear examples of the nuclear weaponry risk, as exhibited on the posters around us today. I would now invite Ramana up to deliver his remarks.
Thank you, Liam.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to all the people who made it possible for me to come here. I've never spoken at such a beautiful room. And as I was telling somebody earlier, I have to kind of try to keep myself focused on my talk instead of looking outside. But if you do, I'm not going to object at all. So the title of the event is about the history of the last 80 years of the nuclear age. And history is interesting in and of itself, but even historians will probably tell you they often do it with a purpose because it bears on the present in some fashion. And the most important thing to remember about the kind of history that I'm going to talk about is that there are over 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world, all of which are, almost all of them are more destructive than the 2 bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we live with the possibility, even if we don't actively contemplate it all the time, that at any moment these weapons can go off, right? As the great psychologist and sort of in his own way a historian of the nuclear age, Robert J. Lifton, who recently died, once put it, he said, the central existential fact of the nuclear age is vulnerability. Right? We are all vulnerable to essentially instant death, and this has been true, I guess, to some since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but especially after the late 1950s, when both the United States and the then Soviet Union got intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can fly across the world and incinerate any place in a matter of minutes. And this is, I think, also important to remember that we live in a world with nuclear weapons, as we see today, sort of increased talk about all kinds of war. I see that the latest issue of the Philadelphia Trumpet, which is down there, says arming for World War III, right? So it's something which is actually happening, and it's also happening with nuclear weapons. All of the countries, there are 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons at this point, as far as we know, starting with the United States, which first developed it and used them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the then Soviet Union, now Russia, and then the United Kingdom, followed by France, followed by China, followed by Israel, followed by India, followed by Pakistan, and lastly, North Korea. There's only one country that had developed the capacity to make nuclear weapons, but then gave up that capacity, which is South Africa. And that coincided with the transition from the apartheid regime to what we have, the democratic regime that we have today. And all of these countries with nuclear weapons, even though they might say that they are not planning to use them, it is the unthinkable, as some people would term it, but in fact, all of them develop nuclear weapons with plans for actually using them, right? And again, the great British historian E.P. Thompson once put it, he said, it's never true that nuclear war was unthinkable. The thought has been thought and put into effect, right? And that's why these countries make plans under certain circumstances to use nuclear weapons, right? And so this is the one reason to think about the history of the nuclear age, because we still are inhabiting a nuclear world. And so I will sort of try to briefly summarize this long history. There's lots of rabbit holes one can go down into, but I'm going to try to avoid doing that. And try to sort of pull out what I see as some sort of more pertinent points. And I'd like to start by, I'll sort of divide it, broadly speaking, into 3 parts. One is to talk about what happened and in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what happened since then a little bit. And what happened is sort of what happened to the people and the people who were dropping it, as well as what was done about it since then. So that will be the second part of the talk. And the third is to kind of offer some thoughts about what we might do about it. I wish I could say what should be done, but I have no such certainty. But I'm going to sort of speculate a little bit on that. So the nuclear weapons that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before we go into that, if you look at these posters, you see some of these posters about life in Hiroshima and Nagasaki before the bomb was dropped. And here, for example, there's a picture of students who are trying to grow food in their schoolyard to try and make up for the lack of food that was being experienced by the Japanese during the war. And that picture is from 1943 or 44. And around the same time as that was happening, efforts to develop the first nuclear weapons were going on in other parts of the world, right? Uranium was being mined here in Canada, in the Congo, which was then under Belgian rule. There was sort of nuclear reactors being built in Washington State, which is kind of southeast of where I live, the Hanford reactors, where uranium that was mined and processed was fed into nuclear reactors, and it was irradiated inside these nuclear reactors to produce this material called plutonium. And plutonium is a material that had never been produced on Earth before, except a very, very long time back for a very short period of time in Gabon, in Africa, under the ground for various reasons, which we don't need to go into. That's just one of those rabbit holes that I'm going to try to duck. Okay, but for the first time ever, some of these materials had been produced in the world, and one of them was plutonium. And plutonium, by the way, is produced in all nuclear reactors, nuclear power plants, and could be used to make nuclear weapons. That's one of the connections that I sort of talk about in my book, but I'm not going to get into that at this point. But just to mention that was happening, as well as uranium was being enriched in Tennessee at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory into a form that is more usable for making nuclear weapons. And then down south of Tennessee in New Mexico at the Manhattan Project, there were hundreds and hundreds of very smart and maybe not so wise scientists and engineers who were working, trying to develop these horrendous weapons of mass destruction. But they were doing so with some idea about trying to understand a new scientific reality, or trying to explore what new nuclear science at that point had just told them, which was that under certain circumstances, very heavy materials, uranium and plutonium in particular, could split into two so-called fission process, producing energy and also producing neutrons that can go and catalyze further fission reactions, thereby setting up what is called a chain reaction. And so a lot of the aim at the Manhattan Project was to try and figure out how to take these nuclear materials and convert them into a configuration that would allow them to have this chain reaction. And the first time they did so and produced a lot of energy doing that was actually predates Hiroshima and Nagasaki by roughly a month. In July 1945, the first nuclear bomb was exploded in New Mexico, the so-called Trinity site. Those of you who saw the film Oppenheimer a couple of years ago might have seen that. That's kind of one of the big, climaxes of the film, if you like. That was the first time that one of these explosions was conducted. It ended up contaminating large amounts of land, including lands of the Native American people. And some of the materials that were produced, including the plutonium, drifted all over North America. And in fact, you can find some traces of that in Ontario, in one of those deep lakes that's usually held out to be one of the markers of the Anthropocene. And considered to be one of the places where you can say that here's a definitive point where the geological history of the world might have shifted. And but then for much of the world, their knowledge about nuclear weapons, or indeed about nuclear science and the possibility of fission, came with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And the bombings were described, were presented in newspapers and magazines around the world. In fact, the Times of India for August 7th, 1945, did carry this picture not picture, but an announcement about the bomb being done, and President Truman's speech about it. And that would have been the introduction for many people around the world to the fact of the nuclear age. And in terms of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki itself, many of these posters there are probably things on the other side, show the kinds of impacts that these weapons had on the people. And one can think about the effects in sort of two categories. One which one might call prompt effects or prompt happenings, and then some which are more delayed. So the three categories of physical phenomena that happen immediately when the bomb explodes. The first thing, if a bomb were to explode, is that there would be this sort of bright flash of electromagnetic radiation, light and heat in particular. And this is extremely intense, so intense that if you had been watching that with your eyes, you'd be blinded. Or your skin, if it's exposed to it, it would get burnt extremely. Things were set on fire. Physical phenomena that one would almost never observe elsewhere at other points you would see. For example, sand, if it's there in one of these, in front of one of these nuclear explosions, the heat that's impinging on the sand is so intense that it starts popping like popcorn. okay, because of the difference in the temperature between the top and the bottom, right? And so these are kinds of things which you never see. So that's the first sort of physical phenomena that is associated in temporal sense. The second would be the blast of radiation, particularly neutrons and gamma rays, that would be let off by the nuclear explosion. And if you were sufficiently close to the point of explosion, that could give you a radiation dose that is significant enough to be lethal. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the third would be, just like any other weapon, a shock wave that is in any weapon. That's probably one of the things that everybody sees, and except that in this case it is far more intense, that it can actually bring down lots of concrete structures and deep and very hard to destroy structures. And so these are the three sort of immediate impacts. But soon afterwards, a number of later impacts also start. The most important of which, in terms of the people who live very close by, is the fact that the initial flash of electromagnetic radiation sets off fires. And these fires start coalescing into a large area full of fires. This fire zone, these fires, when they coalesce, they form what scientists describe as a superfire, which the temperatures can be so high that, probably about 80 degrees Celsius, even if you're not directly in the fire area itself. But also that the temperature is so high that it tends to drive away hot air and draw in cold air from the outside. And sort of like a funnel, if you like. But the cold air, which is coming, the air that is rushing into the fire zone, is so intense that those speeds can be upwards of 50, 80 kilometers per hour. So anybody who's trying to escape from the fire would find it extremely difficult to move away, because they'll be facing this intense wind that is coming up. And this is not only in the case of nuclear weapons, even in the case of the firebombings that happened during the Second World War in Germany and in Japan, in particular places like Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo. We see very similar phenomena. There's some pictures, for example, from Dresden, which show people who are clearly trying to leave the area, but they're crawling on their feet because they are not able to walk in front of the wind, right? And that's the position in which they get burnt. So these are that's another way by which lots of people were killed. And last but not least, there's also a large amount of radioactive material that is produced during the nuclear explosion, and also any material that might be sucked into the mushroom cloud, the kind of iconic symbol of nuclear explosions, that then comes back down in the form of what's called radioactive fallout. And that again is a source of radiation exposure to people. And radiation exposure can kill people sort of, if it's sufficiently high, it kills them pretty much deterministically, meaning that anybody who's exposed to that kind of levels of radiation, there's a very high probability that they will die. But at lower levels, the impact of radiation is what we might call stochastic. In other words, a bunch of people can all get the same levels of radiation, but you can only say in probabilistic terms who is going to develop a cancer or some other health impact as compared to others. Not everybody is going to have the same impact. And this becomes more and more of a feature when radiation levels are lower. And this is part of the reason why there's a lot of debate over the health impacts of nuclear power plants. Again, that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down, but just to mention that is sort of there. So this is kind of the set of effects that happen in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as other nuclear explosions that have happened. There have been over 2,000 nuclear weapons that have been tested in various areas, some above ground, some underground, some in the water, many of them contaminating peoples around the world, in the Marshall Islands, in Semipalatinsk, in Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. And so that's how scientists get to know a lot of these things. And A lot of the explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of them saw these as experiments, trying to understand how this works and how the cities were destroyed. So as a factoid, I would mention that the bombs where the cities where the bombs were dropped, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been earmarked way before as places that might be potential targets for nuclear weapons. And that's why the bombing campaign that Curtis LeMay and others led over large parts of Japan spared those. They were never bombed before that because they wanted to see what the impact of a nuclear weapon would be on a populated city of various kinds. Anyway, so that's sort of one element of it. And subsequently, we've learned a lot more about nuclear weapons and their impacts. But I would just start by also saying that knowledge about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was largely kept under cover. The U.S. Government that was and the U.S. Army that was overseeing Japan didn't allow people to travel very easily. There were a few journalists who sort of managed to get in, and then it took a period of time only after which that the public started learning about it. Initially the U.S. authorities were particularly keen on trying to avoid mention of radiation impacts. So General Leslie Groves, who oversaw the project, he's reported to have said that he believes radiation was a very pleasant way to die, radiation exposure, to the US Congress at some point. But this is all sort of trying to say that the US had not done something which was really heinous. It was trying to keep it under cover, but that didn't last very long. And there were a number of journalists and other people who went in. The best known of them is John Hersey, who wrote a wonderful book called Hiroshima. It first came out in the New Yorker. And Hersey went there and told the story of what happened to the people of Hiroshima through the stories of 6 individuals who were there, and thereby sort of humanized what was happening and trying to sort of make people relate to that. And then, of course, there were various other things that happened, including a fishing boat belonging to the Japanese called Lucky Dragon that happened to be in the path of the radioactive fallout from a nuclear weapons test in the Pacific, and the fishermen got exposed to high levels of radiation. Many of them developed serious symptoms, some of whom died by the time they went back to Japan, and that also created a lot of public outrage. And then there were efforts in various other places, thanks to nuclear weapons testing and concerns about that among members of the public, some of whom did things like trying to collect baby teeth, because those would have strontium, a particular radioactive isotope of strontium, which is mostly in the United States, but even in Canada, for example, Ursula Franklin, the late professor in University of Toronto, had organized such an effort. But it never actually got public funding for that. Anyway, so there's a lot of efforts that were made to try and understand how radiation works, how it sort of causes harm to people, and so on. And then the last thing and the next thing which I would say is that a number of people around the world did studies on trying to say what might happen if a nuclear weapon went off in the city that they were living in, or something of that sort. New York was a common destination. My own sort of introduction to working on nuclear weapons came back in the 1990s when I had just transitioned from doing theoretical physics to starting to think about nuclear weapons and death and things of that sort. And one of the professors, one of my mentors, said, "Oh, you need to do a study of what's going to happen if a bomb goes off in India." And I was initially like, what's the point? We know a lot of people are going to die. What's the reason to do this? But my mentor is my mentor, so I have to do what he says. And so I went in and did it, and I learned a lot. It's that, it's not just the fact that many people are dying, it's in how horrible ways they die, and the scale of it was eye-opening for me. And it was a tool that people in India used as a means to try and activate the public. And this is true around the world. including through films, for example, The Day After or on the beach, which actually doesn't show any nuclear weapons, but it talks about nuclear weapons in a very subtle fashion. And so there's been a long-standing effort to try and democratize or to let people know what would happen in the event of the use of nuclear weapons. And by the 1980s, there was also the realization that as nuclear arsenals around the world grew so much, that if there had been a full-scale nuclear war, then that would have impacts on the climate. The late Carl Sagan was one of the people who talked about something called a nuclear winter, and that has continued till today. People like Alan Robock and Brian Toon and so on have been producing study after study that shows that even a limited nuclear war can have climatic impacts. I'll sort of another rabbit hole I won't go under is to say that there's a lot of uncertainty about these things, and people from within the nuclear weapons establishment claim that these are sort of exaggerated and they're making some assumptions. And I don't know where the truth lies in a way. And I don't think anybody really knows, because we only had a few times when nuclear weapons have been used. So we fortunately don't have the empirical data to be able to distinguish who's right or wrong. But it is perhaps prudent to assume the worst and sort of go ahead with it. Anyway, so that's kind of one dimension of what we have learned. I'd want to now turn to what kinds of responses have been to the impact of nuclear weapons. Obviously, these were the scale of these was so shocking that many people, including scientists and intellectuals and journalists and politicians, were extremely concerned about it. And so the very first resolution of the then newly set up UN First Committee was actually, where is that stupid thing? Yeah. So the very first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly First Committee on International Security from 1946 called for proposals for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. Right? So that tells you something about how important that leaders around the world thought this was going to be. And that the sort of concern about this, that particular call to set up one of these treaties really didn't go anywhere very far till you come all the way to 2017, when the first treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons was adopted at the United Nations. So it took that long for that, at least that aim of an international treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons to actually fructify. But there was sort of the more immediate sets of reactions were often from intellectuals, including scientists, who were very concerned, including in the United States, but also elsewhere, that the new force that they had discovered, the new capacity for destruction, people should understand and they should do something about it. And among the foremost of these was Albert Einstein, who was instrumental in setting up something called the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists in Princeton, New Jersey, and with the explicit aim of trying to educate people. And Einstein thought that I think I might as well read out his quote exactly. He said that, where is that? I am sorry about that. Okay, yeah. He said, "We scientists recognize our inescapable responsibility to carry to our fellow citizens an understanding of the simple facts of atomic energy and its implications for society. In this lies our security, our only security, and our only hope. We believe that an informed citizenry will act for life and not for death." I think that's sort of the philosophy with which many people were approaching this new situation. And there was a lot of activity around that. And I'd like to sort of mention one particular aspect of this activity. And I think the important thing to remember in that particular regard was the fact that many of them saw that the danger with nuclear weapons was not just nuclear weapons, that it had to do with the political context in which these nuclear weapons were being developed. And one particular thing that they all identified as being very critical to trying to understand how nuclear weapons can be used in the world has to do with the idea of nationalism, right? And so I would like to sort of actually read out also the earlier part of Einstein's quote, which said, through the release of atomic energy, our generation has brought into the world the most revolutionary force since prehistoric man's discovery of fire. The basic power of the universe, and where's that? Yeah. The basic power of the universe cannot be fitted into the outmoded concept of narrow nationalisms. Okay? And this was a very widely shared idea. And you should remember that many of these people, including Einstein, had come of age, had become politically active, had worked on the atomic bomb under the backdrop of Nazism, of fascism, right? And they could see what the kind of blood and soil nationalisms that were prevalent in the 1930s could do to populations. They were all, many of them were inspired to work on nuclear weapons precisely because they thought if Hitler were to ever get his hands on these nuclear weapons, there would be no hesitation, he would use it, and that's why they were trying to develop it, right? But I'd also mention as an aside, one more rabbit hole I'm not going to go down into, was that among the scientists who were working, many of them in the Manhattan Project were from Europe. There were many of them were immigrants or what you might actually call refugees from Europe. Many of them were concerned about Hitler, but by 1944, the people who were running the project knew that Germany was not on the path to developing nuclear weapons. They had broken the code, they had sort of other people who were telling them what they were doing, and it was very clear that they were going down the wrong path. They were not going to be able to make the nuclear weapon. And so at that point, only one scientist quit the project, a guy called Joseph Rotblat, who eventually went on to get the Nobel Prize when the Pugwash Committee got the Nobel Prize. And he, for his part, decided he would never work again on nuclear science or technology and turned his attention to thinking about the use of radionuclides for health, for treatment of cancer and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's an aside, but coming back to the question of sort of why nationalism was seen to be a problem, you can understand it from the particular historical context. And Einstein was by no means unique. I can sort of mention other people, but it's also illustrative that the main slogan that some of these people adopted at that time was one world or none. That we should actually overcome all of these national barriers and try to form one world, because as long as this kind of nationalisms are going to be there, then these weapons that would be developed would be used. Okay? For better or for worse, that movement didn't go very far, but you see in that movement the kind of radical potential that would have been obviously quite concerning to people who manage states, right? And so they sort of did a whole bunch of responses to this. And the sort of broad thing I would say is that the effort is to try and manage the crisis, reassure the public that we have this under control. Okay, don't get worried, don't go activism, don't do walk on demonstrations and so on and so forth. And so they sort of the management, I think, sort of took maybe 2 or 3 different strands. One is the sort of the ideological front, developing the idea of what today we call nuclear deterrence. The idea that as long as both countries have nuclear weapons, there would be mutually assured destruction, and so there is no chance of these actually being used, right? And there are lots and lots of political scientists and strategic thinkers spent enormous amounts of time sort of doing all these really pathologically, psychologically pathology, I think, thinking about, thinking the unthinkable and, all kinds of, here's how this nuclear war is actually going to be fought out. It's all completely, if you think about it, it's all completely irrational. because I don't think any of this will actually happen. And one recent book that you might want to look at is Annie Jacobson's book. I think it's called Nuclear War, A Scenario. It's a sort of excellent illustration of how all of the elaborate apparatus that the United States has built up would actually be completely of no use if there's an actual nuclear weapon that's being used, right? And so you have to ask, what is the purpose of spending these literally trillions of dollars on developing this sort of command and control system and all the sort of reactions to that? But that's one strand of sort of thinking which basically says, look, we have this all managed and don't worry about it. The second strand of sort of response from the powers that be was to try and say, look, you guys are all thinking about this nuclear energy all wrong, nuclear science all wrong. It's not just for bad things, not just for making weapons. It can be used for good. And this is the Atoms for Peace program, right? Where President Eisenhower gave the speech, and then other people in the Soviet Union were making similar sorts of statements, which is basically saying, this is such a great technology that we can use it to develop, to generate electricity and do all kinds of wonderful things. And the person who used to head the US Atomic Energy Commission, Lewis Strauss, in one of his chats with journalists said, our children will see energy that is too cheap to meter or something of that sort. Lewis Strauss, in case you're wondering, is also the person who figures in the film Oppenheimer. He's the kind of villain figure in the film, right? Anyway, so there was this whole effort to try and market nuclear energy as the answer, and many countries around the world sort of got into this, and there was sort of trade shows, if you like, which would go to all these countries and sell them the idea of nuclear power. Many countries set up research programs. They would set up laboratories. They would get scientists coming to the US, Canada, and so on, being trained. And Canada, for its part, exported nuclear reactors to countries such as India and Pakistan. And many Indian scientists actually came here to Chalk River near Ottawa to get trained. And so that was a second strand of sort of management of this. And the third, which was kind of partly done by themselves, but also partly in response to public pressure, was the adoption of international treaties and arms control agreements. The first of these was about the banning of atmospheric nuclear weapons tests, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was signed in 1963. And you can sort of trace it to the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when much of the world realized that they came very close to nuclear war. And it was a wake-up moment for a large number of people at that point. And partly because of public pressure, government sort of decided to negotiate all these things. And there has been a series of these since then. And I think the heyday of this arms control arrangements or arms control treaties was in the 1990s, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which had originally been adopted in 1967, underwent an indefinite extension in 1995, but with the promise that two treaties which would try to curb the destructive capacities of nuclear weapons and the amounts of nuclear weapons that could be made, namely the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. They were both supposed to be negotiated. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was negotiated in 1996, but since then there has not been a single arms control treaty on nuclear weapons that has been negotiated at a multilateral level. There has been a couple of bilateral treaties between the United States and Russia, one of which we are hoping will get renewed over the next year, the so-called START Treaty. But other than that, there's been a general slide back, starting with the George Bush administration's leaving or quitting the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and then since then a whole bunch of treaties have been sort of pushed out. The one exception to this is the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons that I mentioned, which is really a treaty that was was sort of pushed by civil society. around the world, and by countries that don't have nuclear weapons. They basically said, look, you guys are not going to do this by yourselves. We are going to have to do this. And some of the, so it's basically a treaty that is open to countries to sign. And at this point, I think the majority of the countries around the world have signed that treaty. Not all of them have ratified it, but I think it's more than 75 countries, or no, 85 countries. I forget the exact number. But anyway, any of you can look it up in a moment. So that treaty was something where countries don't have to have nuclear weapons. In fact, by signing, they say we will never develop nuclear weapons, we will never test, we will not help anybody develop nuclear weapons, and so on and so forth. And needless to say, none of the nuclear weapon states have signed on to that treaty, nor have any of their allies, including Canada. Right? And Canada is a particularly bad example here, in that the model for the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons was the landmine treaty that was negotiated in Ottawa. Right? The Landmine Convention was basically, again, a similar sort of idea where countries who are interested in getting rid of landmines come together and they say we're going to sign a treaty, and eventually, hopefully, countries with landmines will also come and join it. Right? They're not going to wait for them to negotiate this. And it has been relatively successful in that even though countries have not given up landmines, many countries have tried not to use it except in very, very, very special circumstances. The hope is that the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons will set a sort of similar normative basis. It hasn't happened, but it's a tool that's out there that countries and civil society groups can use, and they can use it in multiple ways. For example, in trying to get institutions like banks and so on not to invest in nuclear weapons, by using the argument that now there is some international law that says that nuclear weapons are illegal, right? And so you're investing in something that is illegal. Same story with universities and so on and so forth. So divestment is one way that it can be used. It can also be used to try and block the transport of nuclear weapons by saying, we have signed the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Unless your vessel, you can confirm that you have no nuclear weapons on the vessel, a US or a Russian vessel cannot dock in one of our ports. That kind of effort can be done, it's not something which is going to get rid of nuclear weapons, but hopefully it makes their operations a little bit harder, right? And we see divestment as a strategy, and also blockages as a strategy in trying to oppose the genocide in Gaza, right? The same kinds of efforts have been suggested in the case of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons as well. So I'll sort of now, I don't know, I'm not keeping track of the time. Am I doing okay? Okay. So I'll just now turn a little bit to, before we sort of open a discussion about, what, where are we, what we can do about this. And I think the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons sort of is one starting point to think about how we can act. But before I can actually say anything about what we should do, I think we have to think clearly also about what the we means, right? We are people who are typically out of power. We are sitting in some, library room, and we have very little control over what our states do, right? Whether it's about nuclear weapons or whether it's about a whole bunch of other things, right? That's a general sort of lack of democracy that we see in many, many areas of the world. And so just as a sort of side rant, I would say, I always hated when people say, we have all these nuclear weapons. I'll say, who's this we? What control do you have over your country's nuclear weapons, right? So it's people out there who are sort of in power who are having all these nuclear weapons. And I think it's important to sort of remember where we are, because we should not be trying to think how states think, right? And I want to go back to the comment, the founding assumption of people like Einstein and so on, that tells you that nuclear weapons cannot live with narrow nationalisms, right? And part of why we are sort of susceptible to nationalist thinking is that we are often thinking in geopolitical terms, as though we are those states. And this is a problem in so many instances. For example, we see the debates within the peace movement about what to do about Ukraine, right? And in some sense, it is obvious what we should be doing about Ukraine. But in other cases, in the sense, there's an unprovoked aggression, right? And you have to oppose it, and that's very clear. But if you want to take the point of view that, look, I am interested in addressing all of imperialism in general, and so my anti-imperialism is going to trump my anti war, then there's a problem. And that's because then you would say, Russia is acting the way you would expect the United States to act. What would the United States do if NATO or some NATO-like force expands to Mexico, right? That's the kind of argument you hear. And of course, yes, that might be the way Russia might react, and that may be the way the United States might react. But is that the way you would want them to react, right? And that's something to sort of think about, that you don't want to identify yourself with these states. So that's just a aside. But I think the first, I think, is that we have to take stock of whatever avenues we have to try and block this process of sort of expanding nuclear weapons and militarization more generally. And there, it's important, I think, to remember that nuclear weapons sort of sits at the intersection of two different arenas of work. One is nuclear weapons are very closely related to nuclear energy, as I mentioned. And I'm not going to elaborate on that, but I can talk about it during the Q&A if anybody's interested. And so you cannot think about nuclear energy as its own enterprise and trying to think about it as a solution to climate change and so on and so forth, because by doing that, you are going to strengthen the nuclear weapons lobby as well, the nuclear weapons establishment as well. And so that is one connection. And the other connection is, of course, with the military at large, right? And it's not that nuclear weapons are the only way that states kill people, right? They have a large set of means of violence, state violence of various kinds, starting from military violence. And in that context, now we are talking about Carney expanding, Canada's expenditure from 2% to 5%, right? That is something which we should all be opposing if you're sort of concerned about nuclear weapons, because the two of them are closely related. And they're also if you expand the canvas a little bit larger, you have to see the connections between all forms of state violence, whether it is, what's happening at the border, whether it's what's happening with policing, and what's happening with big tech, and all the many ways in which they sort of intrusively observe and collect all our data and use it in various ways. Last point I want to say is that I see this as the only force that can sort of go against this has been social movements. We have seen the heyday of the social movements or the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s when, because of the Reagan buildup, there was great fear in both the United States and in Western Europe and even in parts of Eastern Europe, which led to the nuclear freeze movement, all kinds of marches. If you come to Vancouver, for example, as you enter Vancouver, there are a couple of places where you will see a sign which says Vancouver is a nuclear-free city, right? And that's a vestige of the 1980s movements that we had. And that's one of the last times when you've seen a kind of rollback of nuclear weapons, like 1980s and 1990s. And that movement has sort of all but dissipated, right? It's very hard to get more than 20 people into a rally somewhere on Hiroshima Day or whatever. So there is that, but these movements cannot be siloed, that they have to be intersectional, that all of these different social movements have to talk, and I don't have to say this here because we are at the social forum, whose primary purpose is to sort of talk about this intersectionality. So I just want to kind of reinforce that, but also to mention that the other big change that sort of allowed the structural change, if I might call it that allowed for the arms control agenda to go further in the 1990s was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right? And the collapse of the Soviet Union gave rise to certain circumstances where you could point out and say all your arguments for why you want to have nuclear weapons, the evil empire, is no longer there, so you shouldn't be having these nuclear weapons. It didn't go far enough because the nuclear weapons establishments found new enemies to weaponize against, right? The so-called terrorists and the war clash of civilizations that Sam Huntington talked about and so on. So there were sort of new ways by which the institutions that benefit from these weapons try to justify their existence and get more and more resources. But it's also true that these things can be challenged only when there are strong social movements that are challenging it. And the collapse of the Soviet Union has to do with social movements in those countries, right, in large part. So anyway, so I'll sort of leave it there. There's no kind of clear conclusion to this, but I'm just going to open up with some thoughts. Thank you.